The shriek of a shearing steel drive shaft was the only warning before a heavy metal band whipped through the air, missing a worker's head by inches and shattering a workbench into splinters. As the dust and sparks settled in the sudden, suffocating silence of the Hollow Creek sawmill, Marlin Whitaker didn't reach for a first aid kit. She lunged for her father's private safe. Her fingers, stained with grease and trembling with a cold she couldn't shake, bypassed the empty cash drawers and pulled out a hidden ledger that felt heavier than the iron machinery outside. Inside, there were no savings to pay the angry men gathered at the door. Only a map of the valley's ancient forests marked with red ink and a contract signed in her father's unmistakable, looping hand. A stone shattered the office window, showering the desk in glass. But Marlin didn't flinch. She was staring at a date on the final page. A deadline that ended in 30 days, after which every home in the valley would belong to a stranger. The man the town called a saint hadn't left her a legacy. He had left her a countdown to a betrayal she could never take back. The foreman's whistle shrieked through the din, sharp as a rusted nail dragged across glass. Marlin's fingers twitched against the splintered railing, knuckles white where the wood bit into skin. She didn't turn, didn't need to. The rhythm of the mill told her everything. The stuttering cough of the conveyor belt, the wet thwack of a log catching on the saw's teeth, the way the air thickened with the scent of sap and burnt oil when the blades overheated. Again. "You deaf, Whitaker?" A voice cut through the noise, rough as gravel under a boot. She recognized the drawl. Dale, the new hire from the trailer park on Route 9, the one who still wiped his nose on his sleeve like a kid. He stood too close, his breath hot and sour with yesterday's beer. "Boss wants the stack cleared before shift's out. Or you planning to stand there admiring the view?" Marlin exhaled through her nose, the sound lost in the grind of the machinery. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for the hook hanging from her belt, the metal cold and familiar against her palm. The logjam had to be broken before the line backed up, before the foreman started screaming about lost minutes, about pay docked for inefficiency. She'd heard it all before. Dale shifted his weight, boots scuffing against the grease-slicked floor. "You hear me, or you waiting for an invitation?" She swung the hook. The impact sent a jolt up her arm, the log splitting with a crack like a gunshot. Sawdust exploded in a pale cloud, coating her arms, her hair, the back of her throat. Dale coughed, waving a hand in front of his face. "Christ, you could have warned a guy." Marlin didn't look at him. The next log was already sliding into place, the belt groaning under its weight. She braced herself, fingers tightening around the hook. The mill didn't care about warnings, neither did she. She stood on the rotting bridge of the Hollow Creek sawmill, inhaling the acrid cocktail of pine resin and metallic dust. Beneath the soles of her boots, the planking vibrated with a rhythmic, bone-deep shudder as giant circular saws shrieked, biting into century-old timber. The scream of the blades was a physical weight, a pressure that settled in her jaw and behind her eyes. Every few seconds, a fine spray of damp sawdust hit her face, stinging like needles. She ran a hand along the jagged surface of the exterior wall, feeling the old frame groan under the relentless assault of worn-out machinery. Rusty chains clattered, dragging massive trunks toward the maw of the primary saw, while steam from the boilers billowed in white, blinding sheets that obscured the faces of the men below. Marlin scanned the floor, her eyes tracking every movement. She saw the way the conveyors stuttered, the way the drive belts frayed at the edges. She moved down the stairs, her boots thudding against the wood, and intercepted Grady near the main line. She pointed at a misaligned guide rail that was causing the timber to cant dangerously to the left. Grady, a man whose face seemed carved from the very oak he cut, wiped grease-slicked hands on a rag and stepped into her path. His brow was a thick, dark line of frustration. "Payday's Friday, Marlin," Grady said, his voice a low rumble that barely carried over the mechanical roar. "The boys are asking about the envelopes. They were light last time. Some were empty." Marlin straightened her shoulders, pulling herself up to her full height. She adopted the stance she remembered from her father, Elijah, the way he used to command a room without raising his voice. She reached out, gripping Grady's shoulder. Her knuckles were white, her fingers digging into the heavy flannel of his shirt. "The mill is standing, Grady," she said, her voice steady, measured. "You see the saws turning? You see the trucks moving? Stability. That's what we have. That's what Elijah promised, and that's what I'm keeping. Count the logs. We're moving more than last month. The money follows the wood." She held his gaze until he looked away, but her knees felt like water. She turned before he could see the tremor in her hands. She walked toward the yard, the air outside slightly cooler, but still heavy with the scent of the valley. Miller, the town's aging postman, was coming through the main gate. He clutched a thick envelope with the embossed seal of the National Bank. He wouldn't look at her. He held the paper out with trembling fingers, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere over her shoulder. Marlin took it. The paper felt unnaturally heavy. She ripped the seal, the sharp edge of the vellum slicing into her thumb. A bead of dark blood welled up, blooming across the stark, black typeface of the header. Notice of foreclosure and asset seizure. The world seemed to tilt. The roar of the mill receded into a dull hum. Cold sweat broke out along her spine, and the letters on the page blurred into illegible black smears. Miller didn't wait for a response. He turned and hurried away, his head ducked low. Marlin stood in the center of the muddy yard, crushing the envelope in her fist. The weight of that official stamp felt like a headstone being lowered onto her chest. Then a sound tore through the air that was louder, sharper than any saw. It was the shriek of snapping metal. Marlin spun. Inside the main sec, a drive shaft had sheared under the tension. A heavy steel band whipped through the air, missing old Tom's head by inches, shearing a massive chunk of wood off a nearby workbench with the force of a cannonball. Tom fell to his knees, burying his face in his hands as sparks showered over him like dying stars. Shards of gear teeth whistled through the air. Marlin sprinted. She lunged for the emergency shutoff lever, throwing her entire weight against the rusted iron. The mechanism groaned, then clicked. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the hiss of escaping steam and the frantic thudding of her own heart. She looked at Tom. His face was ghostly, his hands shaking as he pulled them away from his eyes. The production line was a ruin of twisted metal and jagged edges. She reached Tom first, hooking her arm under his elbow to haul him up. He was light, his bones feeling as brittle as dry kindling. Around them, the other workers closed in. Their faces were masks of soot and sweat, but their eyes held something sharper. Fear, curdled into a simmering, dangerous anger. "Look at this," someone shouted. "Look at this junk. We're gonna die for a paycheck that don't even come?" Marlin turned to face them. She looked at the broken machine, then at the exhausted faces of the men of Hollow Creek. She didn't let her voice shake. "I'll get the parts," she announced, her words hitting the silent air like hammer strikes. "I'll have a crew out from the city if I have to. We're not stopping. Grady, Tom, the back pay will be settled by the end of next week. I give you my word, every cent." She clenched her fists, meeting their eyes one by one. They didn't believe her. She could see it in the way they shifted their weight, the way they looked at the floor. But they didn't move against her. Not yet. Marlin retreated to the office, the door clicking shut behind her. She locked it, the sound of the key turning providing a momentary illusion of safety. She went to Elijah's desk, the massive, scarred oak beast that had dominated her childhood. She dropped to her knees, her fingers searching the underside of the heavy tabletop. Her nails scraped against the wood, picking up decades of dust and grime until she found the hidden catch. She pulled the drawer until it hit the stop, then reached further back, into the cavity behind the frame. Her fingers closed around cold metal, a ring of keys. She moved to the heavy safe in the corner, her breath coming in shallow hitches. She imagined the stacks of cash Elijah might have tucked away, the rainy day fund he always joked about but never showed her. She needed a miracle. She needed the money to fix the line, to pay the bank, to stop the rot. The lock clicked. Marlin pulled the heavy door open. The smell of old, sour paper wafted out. But there was no green, no gold, just stacks of debt markers, tied together with rotting rubber bands. She pulled out a thin, leather-bound ledger. The handwriting inside was Elijah's. Small, cramped, frantic. This wasn't the mill's ledger. It was a record of a different life. She saw columns of figures that didn't match any official report. She saw pawn shop stamps and signatures from private lenders she didn't recognize. Her head began to swim. The man the town called a saint, the man who had built this valley, had been living in a house of cards. She turned the pages, her eyes skipping over dates and locations. Chicago, Atlantic City. The dates matched the weeks when the mill had struggled with cash flow, the times the workers had gone without. Elijah hadn't been reinvesting. He had been losing. The sums were staggering. 5, 6 figures, crossed out with thick, violent pencil marks. He was a gambler. A sick, desperate gambler. Her finger traced a line where he had put up the family's heirlooms as collateral for a single night at a card table. The respect she had carried for him, the heavy mantle of his legacy, began to crumble into ash. He wasn't a leader. He was an addict who had bled the town dry to feed a ghost. At the very bottom of the safe, she found a blue folder. It bore the crest of a major development firm from Chicago. Inside was a contract, signed with Elijah's unmistakable, looping flourish. The words felt like ice water in her lungs. The best timberlands in Hollow Creek, the heart of the valley, no longer belonged to the Whitakers. Elijah had signed them away to cover a massive debt. It wasn't just a loan. It was a total transfer of rights. She gripped the document so hard the edges tore. She flipped to the final page, her eyes catching on a clause highlighted in red ink. The grace period ended in 30 days. 1 month. The developer's plan was laid out in clinical detail. The mill would be razed, the valley would be cleared. In its place, an exclusive hunting club for the Chicago elite. She saw the blueprints, high fences, guest lodges where the workers' houses currently stood, private roads cutting through the ancient groves. The entire infrastructure of Hollow Creek was slated for liquidation. Marlin sank into Elijah's chair. The walls of the office seemed to move inward, pressing the air from her chest. Every smile her father had given the town, every promise of a better future, had been a lie. He had sold the ground out from under them while they were still standing on it. She saw the calendar on the wall. The days were already ticking. She didn't have time to mourn the man she thought she knew. She stood up, swept the documents into her leather bag, and zipped it tight. She had to bury this. If the town found out, if Grady found out, they wouldn't just leave. They'd burn the place to the ground with her inside. The next morning, the silence of the valley was broken by the hum of a different kind of engine. A black, polished sedan pulled up to the gates, its pristine paint job a jagged contrast to the gray dust of the yard. A man stepped out, adjusting his cuffs. Mr. Stone. He smelled of expensive cologne and air-conditioned offices. He walked toward Marlin, holding a leather portfolio, his eyes scanning the dilapidated buildings with the cold gaze of an appraiser. He handed her a document, an inspection warrant with a gold seal. "Marlin Whitaker," he said. His voice was smooth, like silk over a blade. "I believe you're expecting us. We have a right to full access." Marlin didn't move. "The mill is private property." Stone smiled, a thin, bloodless expression. "Not according to the paperwork your father signed. I'm here to ensure the assets are preserved." He walked past her, his polished shoes clicking on the dirty concrete. In her office, he didn't sit. He spread a series of glossy photographs across her desk. They weren't of the mill. They were of Elijah. Her father, his face twisted with a frantic, ugly joy under the neon lights of a casino floor, surrounded by piles of chips and empty glasses. Stone leaned over the desk. "We have dozens of these, Marlin, and the records to back them up. Now, I have a voluntary surrender agreement here. You sign it, we move the timeline up, and you walk away with a small relocation fee. And these photos? They disappear. Your father stays a hero. The Whitaker name stays clean." Marlin looked at the photo of her father. She felt a wave of nausea so strong she had to grip the edge of the desk. She looked at Stone, at his perfect hair and his silver pen. "Get out," she whispered. Stone's smile didn't falter. "Think about it, Marlin. You can't fight a contract this airtight. You're just delaying the inevitable and making it much more painful for everyone involved." He gathered his photos and walked out, his gait casual, insulting. Marlin didn't wait. She grabbed her bag and ran to her car, the tires spitting gravel as she tore out of the yard. She drove toward the edge of town, the forest a blur of green and brown. She needed a way out. She needed a lawyer who wasn't on a corporate payroll. She burst into Arthur Miller's office, her palms slamming onto his cluttered desk. Arthur, a man who had been her father's friend for 30 years, jumped, his glasses sliding down his nose. "Marlin? What in God's name? Look at this, Arthur." She threw the contract down. "Tell me there's a hole. Tell me he didn't do this." Arthur took the document with the tips of his fingers, as if it were a live coal. He moved to the lamp on his desk, the ticking of the wall clock the only sound in the room. He turned the pages slowly, his face sagging. He shook his head. "Marlin. The alienation clauses. They're ironclad. Every signature is witnessed. Every transfer is verified. There are no loopholes here." Elijah. He knew what he was signing. Marlin felt the last bit of hope die. But then her eyes drifted to the corner of Arthur's desk. There sat a heavy, blue crystal ashtray. It bore the etched logo of the Chicago development firm. Next to it was a leather-bound planner, the kind that cost more than Arthur's monthly rent. She looked at Arthur, really looked at him. She saw the way his sleeve pulled back to reveal a gold cufflink. "How much did they pay you, Arthur?" she asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Arthur's eyes darted away. He slumped in his chair, the weight of the secret finally breaking him. "Elijah was drowning, Marlin. I facilitated the transitions. I ensured the town didn't find out too early. It was for the best, to keep the peace." He reached out, trying to grab her sleeve. "Take the money, Marlin. Stone's offer. It's the only way you get out of this with anything. This town is dead anyway. Don't go down with it." Marlin wrenched her arm away. the disgust thick in her throat. She didn't say another word. She ran back to the mill, but as she crested the final hill, she saw it. A pillar of thick, oily black smoke was rising from behind the main cech. She screamed, though there was no one to hear. She floored the accelerator, skidding into the yard. The warehouse where they stored the finished lumber was an inferno. The smell of burning resin was overpowering. Men were running, shouting, throwing buckets of water that did nothing against the roar of the fire. Marlin grabbed a heavy canvas hose, the pressure of the water nearly knocking her off her feet. Grady appeared beside her, his face black with soot, helping her steady the line. They fought the heat until her hair smelled of singed protein, and her skin felt like it was bubbling. The fire raged, leaping from the wood to the oil drums, creating a wall of gray steam and orange flame. When the fire finally died down to a smolder, Grady walked toward the back of the ruins. He reached into the scorched brush and pulled out a metal canister. It was empty, but the smell of gasoline was unmistakable. He turned to Marlin, his eyes hard, cold. "Found this," he said, dropping it at her feet. "Funny how this happens right after that suit shows up. You trying to collect the insurance, Marlin? You burning our futures for a check?" Grady, no, but he was already hitting the fire bell, the iron clanging across the valley. The workers gathered, a circle of angry, desperate men. They looked at the ruins, then at Marlin. "Where's the money, Whitaker?" someone yelled. "You burning the wood 'cause you can't pay us?" Marlin stood her ground, but she didn't speak. She couldn't tell them the truth, and she wouldn't tell them a lie they wouldn't believe. She watched as Grady threw his work gloves into the dirt. One by one, the men walked away, leaving their tools where they lay. The mill went silent. The days that followed were a slow-motion car crash. Marlin tried to access the mill's accounts, but the ATM at the gate flashed a red, rejected notice. She found a letter in her mailbox. The accounts were frozen pending the asset seizure. She was penniless. She looked toward the forest and saw the black-clad security guards Stone had hired. They stood at the edge of the trees with shotguns, their presence a silent threat. The valley was being fenced in. In a desperate move, she tried to move the remaining equipment under the cover of night. She and a few loyalists loaded the portable saws onto trucks, hoping to sell them for scrap to pay the men. But as they reached the highway, the blue and red lights of the sheriff's cruiser cut through the dark. Sheriff Roberts stepped out, his badge gleaming. He didn't look at her. He just slapped an impound notice on the windshield. "Evidence," he said. "Part of the arson investigation." Marlin realized then that the rot went all the way to the top. The law, the bank, the lawyers, they were all part of Stone's machine. She retreated to the mill's archive room that night, her mind racing. She began tearing through the old files, looking for anything, any scrap of information Elijah might have missed. She found a false panel behind a shelf of dusty ledgers. Inside was a roll of yellowed maps. She spread them out, her phone light illuminating the details. They were geological surveys Elijah had kept hidden. Huge blue-shaded areas marked the underground strata, water. A massive high-pressure aquifer sat directly beneath the mill. It was a strategic reserve of pure, fresh water, worth more than all the timber in the state. She looked at Stone's development plans again. He had listed the land as depleted and environmentally dead to drive the price down and bypass state regulations. He wasn't building a hunting club. He was seizing a water right worth millions, and Elijah had known. He had used the secret of the water as his final chip, but he had lost that too. The next morning was the town's anniversary. A stage had been set up in the square. Stone was there, prepared to announce his generous investment in the town's future. The whole town had gathered, their faces grim, their anger simmering just below the surface. Marlin walked through the crowd. She felt the weight of their hatred, the heat of the glares. She stepped onto the stage, interrupting Stone mid-sentence. "You want the truth?" She shouted into the microphone, the feedback whining across the square. She didn't talk about the hunting club. She didn't talk about the investment. She pulled out the geological maps and the secret ledgers. She read the names of the casinos. She read the names of the men Elijah had sold them to. She showed the town the maps of the water they were standing on. "My father lied to you," she said, her voice breaking but loud. "He sold your lives to pay for a deck of cards. And this man, Stone, he's here to steal the very water under your feet. He's been lying to the state, lying to the bank, and paying off our sheriff and our lawyer to keep you quiet." The crowd erupted. It wasn't a cheer, it was a roar of pure, unadulterated fury. Stone tried to reach for the maps, but Grady was already on the stage. The guards moved in, but they were outnumbered 10-1 by men who had nothing left to lose. In the chaos, Marlin saw Arthur Miller trying to slip away, with a briefcase full of original titles. She jumped from the stage, tackling him near the edge of the square. They hit the ground, the leather of the briefcase tearing as they fought for it. Grady and Old Tom stepped in, their heavy boots pinning Arthur to the pavement. The briefcase popped open. Original deeds, unrecorded transfers, and the evidence of Stone's fraud spilled across the dirt. Marlin sat on the steps of the courthouse an hour later, watching the state police lead Stone and Arthur away in handcuffs. The sheriff was gone, his badge stripped, but there was no celebration. The mill was saved from the developer, but the Whitaker name was finished. The town knew everything now. They knew their saint was a fraud. They knew Marlin had kept the secret as long as she could. She walked back to the mill one last time. She signed the papers, turning the entire property over to a worker-owned cooperative. She gave the keys to Grady. She didn't ask for a seat on the board. She didn't ask for a job. She packed her single bag and walked toward the gate. The sun was setting over the valley, the light catching the tops of the trees she had saved. No one said goodbye. No one thanked her. They just watched her go, their eyes cold, their hearts hardened by the truth she had forced them to see. Marlin reached the highway and didn't look back. She had lost her home, her father, and her name. But as she walked, she felt the weight of the broken watch on her wrist. Elijah's watch. She unbuckled it and let it fall into the tall grass by the side of the road. The silence of the valley was finally her own, was